My name is Ene Rammeld. I am from Estonia. I left my country in 1981 in very difficult circumstances. At the end of 1976, my husband applied for political asylum. He had made some unusual movies, which the Russians didn't like. Estonians, on the contrary, liked them. At the time, you had to send your scripts to Moscow first before making a movie. It was a long process, and once the Russians finally got the film, they were disappointed straight away because it was not the way they expected when reading the script. It was a hassle. They put the film in quarantine, and he broke down at the end of 1975. Once he told me, "You know, as I am a filmmaker, I've been invited to the Cannes Festival. What do you think?" And I said yes, and then we started discussing it on the way to the cemetery, because this was the only place where we were sure the KGB would not listen to our conversations. We were facing his mother's grave, and we decided that he would apply for political asylum. When he did, I never imagined that they would make my life so difficult. The day after, the head of broadcasting, my husband had started his career working for the Estonian television, came to our house and warned me, "If you ever decide to go to France, forget about getting a visa. But you can still fill in the forms. In the Soviet Union, you could kill your mother, your sister, whoever, and they would always find an excuse. You were drunk, you were retarded, or whatever. But seeking political asylum in another country meant that you were an enemy of the people." I listened to the radio all the time. We would hear that Stalin loves children, that he does a lot for people, that life is great, etc. But I was aware that we had no fruit, no bananas or anything. I didn't even know that bananas existed back then, actually. My mother told me that when I was a child, I was very cute, but I had spots all over my face because we had nothing to eat. I was 8 the first time I ate butter. The shops were empty. After the Soviet Union and the Russians settled, there was nothing in the shops. To get sugar, you had to queue. Thinking back, it was totally crazy. To stay alive, when my mother gave birth to her second child, and we realized that we couldn't live in Tallinn any longer because we had no access to land, we went to Turi. Between Tartu and Tallinn, there's a town called Turi. We had a patch of land and grew carrots and potatoes, etc. And our health suddenly improved. From the age of 7, I ate very well because my father was a hunter. We traveled from place to place because it was the only way to stay alive. When I was at my grandmother's, from the age of 7, she used to say, when the country was independent, we had clementines, fruits, bananas. And I would say to her, "Grandmother, you're crazy. There's no such thing." And she would reply, "You're a born communist." I was brainwashed by the radio because they would say that we lived in heaven. Even with no clothes to put on, nothing to eat or buy, it was still heaven on earth. I was brainwashed and had arguments with my grandmother. And at school, I was the perfect pioneer. When Stalin died, I cried. I was the only one because I was sucked in by their stories of Stalin's love for children. And I planned to buy a suit for Stalin when I grew up, because I thought he was so poor with all the money he gave to the children, and he couldn't afford a new one. I was a bit cheeky back then, and I said to myself, he could at least get himself a new suit and put on a tie. That's why, when I was young, I was torn between being completely convinced that life was great and what the old people were saying, including my grandmother, with whom I talked a lot. I was very interested in history. And suddenly I thought, crikey, people had a good life back then. What's going on? And Estonia's independence had not lasted for long, just 20 years. So little by little, I was a pioneer because I thought it was normal. And although I had completely changed sides, I did what everyone else was doing to avoid standing out. Well, if you look at what's going on with kids at school nowadays, it's clear that, in comparison, everything was free for us. All kinds of activities, singing, dancing, sport. I did all the activities free. It was fabulous. I had my first real shock when I arrived in France. My son had practiced judo in Estonia and had a brown belt. He wanted to continue, but I quickly realized that my financial resources were too limited to pay for the classes, and he stopped. That's why I'm saying that the system was quite clever. In fact, I started lying quite early. It was almost a matter of life and death. We knew what we were discussing and with whom. The system was paranoid. When a Polish director came to Tallinn, we said, "Don't say anything negative about the regime." That's how they kept people under control. But when foreigners came to our house, Poles for instance, we would unplug the phone. We would talk, and they would always ask the same questions, the same as yours. We didn't know how to answer because of the potential presence of microphones in the room. When my husband applied for political asylum, I knew any phone conversations would be fake. I could never speak freely. You had to pretend constantly. When I arrived in France, at the age of 35, it was a shock. People of my age were still so young. I thought, my God, they look like teenagers. Because of the system, or some other reason, we were adults even before birth. I was so grown up when I was young that when I arrived in Paris, I started doing silly things, going to nightclubs, experiencing a new way of living. Everything I hadn't done before, I caught up on later.